So during this video, I'm going to guide you through my creative process for the 100-day project on how I've created this multi-layered one pull print based on the artist Rex Ray, so inspired by his beautiful collage work. I'm going to guide you through the full process. So if there are parts of it that you're not interested in, there's quite a lot of prep to this piece, research, creating the shapes, cutting the masks. If that bit doesn't interest you, just forward on a little bit until we get to the gel plate, and then you'll see my full printing process as well. So this is Rex Ray's work. This is what I was inspired by. Love the gorgeous shapes, the colours, the way the artwork is assembled, and this is the source of my inspiration. I then went on to the computer and I found that was the best way to kind of get the right scale for my print, because I'm using my 16 by 20 inch gel plate. So it's often hard to get the right scale for the shape. So I designed the print to scale using my computer, then cut out my masks. The problem with that is I got completely bored with all the planning aspect of it. And when I got to the gel plate, my plan went completely out the window. So you'll see as I progress through the print, I problem solve as I go along with mistakes that I make. A few things to bear in mind. This print was done over a 17-18 day period. There was lots and lots of drying time in between the layers. Often I applied multiple coats of the same colour on one shape to make sure I built up that opacity and that intensity of colour. And maybe my video doesn't kind of express all of that time. So I think it's important just to point those aspects out. 100-day project has been a great experience for me because it allows me to, I'm very an impatient printmaker. So I might spend half a day in the studio max just playing, and I will rush prints. I won't allow the layers to dry in between, where when you're doing the 100-day project, it's much easier to just come out for 10 minutes while you've got something in the oven cooking and apply a layer of colour and allow it to dry. And I think that was a success for this one pull print because there's so many layers on it. Anyway, I'll let you watch the video, see what you think, drop me a comment below, and I hope you enjoy it.
So this is the colour palette I've chosen to experiment with, and I've got the paint grey, an olive green, an orange, turquoise and Titan buff. They're all opaque paints, and I'm starting off by putting a small amount of the olive green on my gel plate and using kind of a patchwork technique with the pieces of paper to apply just blocks of colour to each piece of paper, so I can start to build almost like a colour book, a swatch palette, where I can experiment with the colours, see how they sit next to each other, see how they overlap. And I'm just going to repeat this process with each of the colours. I find this process really useful because it's often difficult to know, even with opaque and transparent, you know, what the coverage of each paint is going to be like, how they're going to sit on top of each other, and what other tones and shades each paint are going to create. So I find it much easier to kind of actually put them on the gel plate with really thin layers, so I've got a realistic expectation of what I'm going to achieve from these colours. And you can see I'm just working through each of the colours, so I'm now on to the turquoise, and again just using the same pieces of paper, moving them around my gel plate to apply those blocks of colours. So this process does take a little bit of time to work through all the colours, and I'm not looking to make a nice fabulous print. I'm purely looking to create a colour palette that I can use and help me decide how I'm going to develop my print going forward. So this is my last colour now. I'm on Titan Buff, and obviously the lightest colour in my palette. So I found this process really important to see how good the coverage was on this particular brand of Titan Buff, how it was going to sit next to the other colours, but also how it was going to overlap and what kind of coverage I would achieve with this colour. So I've got my colour swatches here. I'm having a look at the order of the colours, what the colours are like sitting next to each other, and I'm already having doubts about that olive green. I'm not sure whether I'm happy with the way that sits with the other colours at this point. So next I'm going to experiment using a sushi mat, some mesh, I've got a placemat there, some textured wallpaper. I'm going to look at creating some textured papers using wet strength tissue paper, because the idea behind this is I'm going to use them to collage directly onto the gel plate. So therefore I want these papers to go transparent, so then I can layer colour on top of those papers as well. So I'm starting here with the sushi mat, just pressing it into a very thin layer of paint on my gel plate, and then I'm going to pull the print using wet strength tissue paper. And you can see I'm laying this over my colour swatches to see exactly how opaque and what you can actually see through, what colours you can see through that tissue paper. So I've done the exact same process, but with the turquoise paint. I'm now using the olive green paint, and again, just using my brayer to roll out a really thin layer of paint on my gel plate. And this time laying down my textured wallpaper, pressing it down firmly onto the gel plate, and then removing it to reveal the texture. So laying the tissue paper down on the gel plate, trying to smooth it out so there's not too many wrinkles before pulling it back to reveal the texture. So this time I'm using a section of a bath mat and just again pressing that down into a thin layer of paint. And this is one of my favourite textures. I just really like the grid pattern that it produces, and again picking that print up with some wet strength tissue paper. What works about this grid pattern as well is there's quite a lot of what I call windows. So that is going to enable other colours to show through that pattern when I apply this directly to the gel plate. I actually spent quite a lot of time creating these papers. I just kind of got a bit carried away, if I'm being honest. So this is the last one I want to show you. So this is a placemat that I've picked up. And again, I'm pressing this firmly onto the gel plate that's got a very thin layer of Payne's grey. I really like the marks that this placemat has left on the gel plate, and this is definitely one of my favourite collage papers. So like I said, I made quite a few papers, so I'm just going to quickly run through to show you all the different papers that I've created. And the thing is, if I don't end up using these in this project, they're gorgeous papers, so they can be used again in another mixed media project, so nothing's wasted. So what I'm doing here now is I need to test how these papers are going to work against my colour palette. So I've got those blocks of colour again. I'm applying matte medium to the paper, and then just small sections of the wet strength tissue paper, and I'm overlapping them over multiple colours so I can really test if I like those papers and if they're going to work. And I found this process to be really helpful, because especially as you can see now as I get onto the green papers, they just don't work for me across this colour palette. So this process has been worthwhile in terms of I've now made that decision that olive green's out. So I'll start to think about what other colour I can use instead of the olive green. So the next stage is to start cutting the masks and stencils out of Yupo paper. So I've just gone back to the original shapes that I'd drawn using my computer, and I've traced them onto the Yupo paper, and I'm just using a nice sharp craft knife with a metal ruler on my cutting mat to hand cut these stencils and masks out. So this part of the process is really time consuming, so I've just sped this video along a little, but it's important to take your time. So at this point, when I actually get to the gel plate, is when my plan completely goes out the window and I just get lost in the process. So I am starting off with laying my stencil onto the gel plate, applying a small amount of paint grey using my brayer, and then peeling the stencil off to reveal the shape that's left behind. And I'm repeating this process, again, not sticking to that original design. I've already kind of gone off proportion there, and you can see it's leaving a line that's come from the excess ink over the stencil, and I'm just using a wipe, a baby wipe there, to remove that excess paint. So now this layer is completely dry, I'm ready to apply the next layer. So again, I'm using my stencil. I've placed it down on the gel plate, but this time I am using a sponge to apply the paint, so I can have more control basically, because I only want half of it with the orange and half with the turquoise. And this is the second time I've applied this paint, so I've let it dry in between and give it a second coat so the colour appears much stronger. And I'm just going to let this completely dry and repeat the process on the other sections of the print. Finally I've swapped to a grey, so I chose the grey to replace that olive green in the end, and I'm just using this neutral grey as an alternative colour. So I'm now adding more stencil detail. I'm using the Titan buff, so I've laid the stencil down and using the brayer to roll the paint over the top, and then again letting this completely dry. Peeling back the stencil to reveal the next layer of pattern on my design. So next I'm applying matte medium directly to my gel plate, and I'm going to start adding the collage papers for the next layer of my print. You can see I've got a piece of paper under my gel plate that I've just drawn a central line, and I'm using this to kind of a guide to help me position where the papers need to go and where the blocks of colours need to go. So I've added a layer of medium underneath the tissue paper, and I'm also applying a layer of the gel medium on top of the tissue paper. And it's important that you do that because you need each layer to stick to each other so it all pulls off as one print at the end. I'm using a catalyst wedge to smooth down my papers to make sure they're adhered to my gel plate, and then just repeating the process. So I've now laid down my next stencil and using a sponge applicator to apply the next layer of colour. And again, I'm going to repeat this process across the gel plate with the different colours, but making sure they're completely dry and adding 2 layers of colour to each shape. And I'm also cleaning the Yupo stencil in between to keep my colours nice and crisp. So once this layer is completely dry, I'm now switching to my other stencil, and this time I'm going to use orange to apply another layer of pattern. I really wish I'd have took the extra time to create this stencil out of Yupo paper rather than copier paper, because you can see the paint is just bled underneath the stencil. And I'm just going to use a baby wipe to try and touch that up and clean those lines up. So for my next layer, I'm using my shapes as a mask. So I'm masking off that orange because I want to protect that colour before adding my next block of colour over the top. So I can't express this enough that I'm leaving every single layer to completely dry before the next layer. So now you can see I'm back onto my matte medium and applying another layer of collage. So while that's drying, I'm now repeating the same process as earlier, where I'm masking off that turquoise shape and then applying another layer of colour. Then peeling back the stencil, followed by the mask. So once completely dry, I'm now using the next stencil, but this time I'm using my brayer to spread a nice even colour. I'm repeating the process with the neutral grey, and I've decided to do this to try and cover up how uneven and wobbly that stencil was with the orange. And I'm also trying to think about my composition and balance, the balance of those shapes. So for the next layer, I'm back onto the collage papers directly onto the gel plate. And you can see I just keep jumping from one technique to the other, allowing the other parts to dry. So I'm just moving around the plate. So I'm adding another layer of collage paper that's going to act as my background, overlaying those shapes. Again, using the matte medium underneath the paper and on top, making sure it's all glued down. So I've now just used some copier paper to mask off the other areas of my gel plate, and I'm now using my brayer to roll the orange across the tissue paper. I'm removing the copier paper and then allowing that block of colour to dry. So I've switched back to my stencil and now adding another layer of colour using my brayer. And then while that area is drying, I've moved across to the other side of the gel plate. I've masked off the areas I don't want paint to be on. And then I'm using the neutral grey again and applying the next layer of colour over that pattern. And then switching to the opposite side of the plate again and going in with the turquoise for another background layer of colour. I really like this stencil, so I'm going to try and use it again, this time with the turquoise paint to add some pattern as another layer. You can really see how the print is starting to come together now as I am applying the background blocks of colour. So again, masking the areas off on my plate before going in with my brayer. And this time I'm using the really pale Titan buff colour. And again, I just want to remind you that I'm leaving this to dry in between and adding a second layer of colour to every shape that I'm applying to get maximum opacity and colour impact. I really wasn't sure about adding the Payne's Grey, such a strong colour, to the background. I thought the shapes might be lost, but I just felt it needed some contrast, so I just decided to go for it. So at this point, I'm really starting to struggle with the composition and getting the right balance. One side is quite busy, the other isn't. So I decided where I got some really large blocks of colour, I needed to apply more interest. So I'm using the masking tape and to peel away some of the dried paint. And the idea behind this is then to create more windows where I can add more detail that's going to show through on the final print. So this time I'm using a piece of the really light collage paper I created at the beginning of this video, and this is the paper created using the Titan buff colour. And again, this is going to act as a final background. So now I'm starting to think about the small details. So I'm just adding a little strip of the wet strength tissue paper there to add a little bit more interest. Now this section here is the section I've had the most difficulty with because I just couldn't get it to balance due to the way I originally positioned those original shapes. So what I decided to do is use the little bits of that I'd cut from my stencil, and I'm just using those shapes in a mixture of the copier paper and tissue paper again to repeat the pattern in a slightly different way and add a little bit more interest to that area. So starting to have doubts that that dark paint grey is a little bit too dominant. So I decided to use the masking tape to go back in and remove some of that paint to add some additional texture and break up that heavy colour. So still wasn't happy with the way this area was turning out. So I thought, I've got nothing to lose. So I decided to actually use the stencil this time and actually adhere the stencil that I've been using when creating these shapes. So I'm laying that stencil down with gel medium and making sure it's stuck down really well. So late at night, I nipped back into the studio and just added a layer of the turquoise over those areas. And then you can see when I flip the plate over, that gives me an idea of how the finished print is going to look. To pull my final print, I am applying a generous amount of the gel medium using a palette knife and then using my brayer to distribute this nice and evenly across my gel plate. It's really important that I don't miss any areas across the gel plate. I'm laying down a sheet of heavyweight cartridge paper and giving it a good rub down to make really good contact on the gel plate, and then I'm going to weight this down with some books and leave it to dry overnight. So this has had a good 24 hours to dry, and now I'm removing the books from the gel plate and I'm going to pull the print. So I flipped it over and I'm actually pulling the gel plate from the paper rather than the paper from the gel plate. I just find it's much better chance of success when you've got this amount of layers to do it in this way. And you can see it's really quite hard work with the size of that gel plate, really pulling that off the paper. So you do need some muscle power. I've popped a mount around the print and just rotating it just to see the overall composition and which way I prefer the print, because it works as a multi-directional print. Feel free to drop me a comment and let me know whether you prefer the print portrait or landscape. It's always good to know other people's opinions. And this is just a close-up of some of the details of the print. Overall quite successful, massive learning curve, lots to take forward, and I hope you've enjoyed watching.
So I hope you enjoyed the video and a little insight to my creative process. Please like and subscribe to my channel, and I'll also drop some links in the comments below if you are interested in signing up to my newsletter to learn about in-person workshops and events that are coming up. And I'll also drop a link to join the waitlist for my new online course that's due to be released later this year, and that's called Pushing the Boundaries. And really it's a little bit more of an advanced gel printing course where we are looking at developing techniques with the aim to produce more of a fine art style gel print. So, hope to see you next time.